I need to disclose upfront that I found working on my tenure file to be kind of soothing. When I'm lost in an essay I'm trying to untangle in revision, or when I'm trying to figure out how to make a mid-semester pivot in a course that's not going as I'd hoped, it's nice to make the mental shift away from the hardest work I do into the clean and simple task of cataloging the things I've already done. Sadly, despite this, even I did not enjoy the early drafting of the dossier narratives. I think some part of me may have felt that if I'm having a good time writing them, I'm probably doing it wrong. If I'm having a good time, I'm probably being myself. And if I'm being myself, I'm not embodying what I imagine to be the disembodied voice of academe, a voice stripped of character, seriously scholarly, riskless. One might assume I'd be predisposed to dossier narrative excellence, being a personal essayist who teaches creative writing. Unfortunately, that did not make it easy. It's possible it made it harder. I thought I had to set aside my voice and try to conjure up a new one so I could pretend to be a person who deserved tenure. To be honest, it's been hard for me to shake the feeling that I'm getting away with something by being myself on the tenure track at an institution as prestigious as The Ohio State University, doing what I can best describe as Elissa Washuta studies, the discipline dedicated to the investigation of who I am and why I'm like this. The case of nerves I'm describing was here with me as I began to write this talk. It is true that I'm not fit for the task of telling you all how to write dossier narratives like diamond blades that cut through the dense layers of all that's been accomplished since you got here. I don't have any templates for narratives that make some sense of the bullet points sorted into buckets for research, teaching, and service. I can't tell you exactly how to explain it all, because what worked for me is unlikely to work for you, and I guess that's the point. After many failed drafts of my dossier narratives, after annual reviews in which I learned I still hadn't understood the assignment and had to start over, I finally accepted that I had to try the thing I hadn't tried yet, the thing I do best, and thus the riskiest approach, being myself. I think it may be possible to bypass the anguish and head straight for the gratification. Maybe. I can't give you directions, but I can retrace my steps and show you where I got stuck. I started, as one does, with blank expanses following questions that could be answered all sorts of different ways. There was the biographical narrative, which I assumed was not going to look like my book flap author bio, my Wikipedia page, thank goodness, or my Guggenheim application career narrative. And that was true. But knowing that was not even close to half the battle. There was the teaching section, which I immediately wrote off as something I would never get right, because everything I could think to say was an utterly cringe cliche about creating safe spaces for students to take risks. There was the research section, which I figured I could just fill with an amalgamation of successful grant application narratives. There was the service section, which, to be honest, I didn't think about at all. I'm going to take you through my failed attempts, and I'm going to start with my teaching statement. Looking back at my first stab at a brief description of my approach to and goals in teaching, major accomplishments, and plans for the future in teaching, I see a narrative that is really only recognizably mine in that it includes two quotes I refer to so often in my teaching that their mention becomes a class joke before everyone even knows everyone else's names. I'm not sure whether my teaching statement was so bad because it represented an attempt to file down my pedagogy to fit it into the box I thought would be its best packaging, or because I didn't fully understand what I was doing well and why it was working. But let me tell you, it was not good. For example, here's the second paragraph. In all classes, I consider my role to be that of an informed, experienced facilitator who can introduce students to unfamiliar texts, assign creative writing exercises with expectations for completion that push students to take risks, provide feedback on creative work, lead discussions, and educate students on elements of craft. I begin workshop courses with several weeks of assigned readings and writing prompts that allow us to establish relationships, rhythms, and vocabularies before workshops of students' essays begin. Sure, I do all that. Every single creative writing instructor at Ohio State does that. My teaching statement didn't do a whole lot more than establish that I was aware that I was doing at least the bare minimum. But that's not an accurate representation of my teaching, which is intentional, experimental, and built upon a clear set of values. I put a lot of work into my teaching, but you wouldn't know it from that first draft of my narrative. I genuinely could not have told you what parts of my pedagogy were mine alone. I would go on to figure it out through experimentation with the teaching itself and through conversations with colleagues following their visits to my classes. Once I understood that, I understood how I was going to write about what distinguished my teaching and why I do what I do. Before that, though, I knew I had to throw out the teaching statement and start over. During my annual review, a senior colleague suggested I approach it as though I was going to write something I'd publish. That seemed absolutely bizarre. Why would anyone publish my teaching statement? Eventually, I'd understand that the value of that approach was not to have a publishable essay about my teaching. It was to write as myself, as a person who reveres the sentence and believes the paragraph to potentially be as powerful as a witch's incantation. I mentioned author quotes I'd included in my first draft. I did cut them in revision, but I'll share them with you because they speak to how I write essays. And once I got it right, they shaped my dossier narratives too. The first is John D'Agata's notion that maybe every essay automatically is, in some way, experimental. The second is Mary Karr's framing of narrative voice as an operative mindset and way of perceiving that naturally stems from feeling oneself alive inside the past. Eventually, I would put those principles to work in my dossier narratives, treating them as experiments as I do with my course designs and essay drafts. And I would feel myself alive inside my narratives of my work and what it meant to me. But we're not there yet. I need to first tell you about my research statements. This was the part I thought I already knew how to do. I had gotten enough arts grants to know I was good at applying for them. I knew how to explain my methods to audiences outside my discipline and how to fit an encapsulation of a book into a paragraph. Not just its plot points, but its essence. I imagine most of us are more practiced at writing about our research than our teaching and service. And I think that's why I was so thrown. I thought I had mastered the form, and that led me to neglect the unique rhetorical situation before me. I was also distracted by the formatting of the document, which I have to mention because I think it's easy to get so hung up on getting the minutiae right that we neglect the bigger picture of the final product. My first attempts at the core research narratives were too brief and too isolated. I described the work I had done and the next book I wanted to write, and I talked about my particular aesthetic, but I didn't talk about what was underneath that. I didn't talk about the core the work emanates from. And crucially, I didn't say enough about the quality indicators, because I simply did not know what they were. And I definitely didn't know why they mattered. I had never been asked to write about my work's impact, only its potential. I knew how to speak to quality, but not how to show that I wasn't the only one who recognized it. This brings us to service. In response to the prompt, brief elaboration that provides additional information about service activities listed above. My first draft was simply the word none. I figured I'd listed my roles and described the responsibilities associated with each. I didn't really have anything else to say. I revisited these narratives every year. I began to understand the project of the dossier by studying models from my own discipline and getting detailed critiques from colleagues. After my fourth year review, a few major things finally clicked. First, when it came to research, I couldn't simply write about why my work is good. I had to write about why it's important. I had to be thorough, detailed, and thoughtful in enumerating my quality indicators, and I had to lay out the disciplinary context for what they meant. Second, in writing about my teaching, the emphasis shouldn't be on what I do in an average day or even in a semester. I needed to focus on the values that remained constant as the driving force behind my pedagogical experiments. It wasn't about my methods so much as it was about why I think the world is a little better because I teach the way I do. Third, the service statement was an opportunity to contextualize my accomplishments within my idiosyncratic journey to the job. Long story, but basically, I arrived 8 years after finishing my terminal degree, no longer a brand new emerging writer because of the book and the grants on my CV. I didn't think the tenure track was open to someone like me. I didn't immediately realize that the service narrative could show that my literary career and my academic one were not really separate at all. That when I was engaging with my readers and introducing them to other writers' work, and when I was helping open the publishing and funding gates to other minoritized writers, I was doing service, even though I wasn't doing it for the sake of my tenure file, and in fact, didn't even realize it would count. Service tends to be thought of as the least vital part of our work, but it can be the connective tissue that binds it all together. I am not doing the work of writing and teaching in isolation. I am doing it for myself and for others. Really, it's no wonder that it was so hard to get this right. It is hard to say that I think I have the power to make the world a better place. And it is really hard to say I've actually already done it. My imposter syndrome is outside the scope of this talk, probably, so I'll leave that one be. And I'll end by talking about the dossier as a finished document. I can think about it as a kind of collage essay, my primary literary form, a cohesive whole assembled from disparate textual parts. The dossier opens with a biographical statement that puts the file in context and directs the reading. The other narratives frame and respond, comment and contextualize, and explain what the headings and citations can't convey. The narratives allow us to reach across disciplinary lines, not by erasing the terminology that sets us apart, but by inviting a reader into the language we rely on to describe our work with precision. And the ending offers us a chance to pull it all together. Since this is a keynote and not a dossier, I'll stop short of really getting into why my dossier was effective. And also, to be honest, I don't fully know how my audience experienced it. The outcome was successful. The feedback was positive. When I sent off the tenure file, I had the feeling I have whenever I submit an essay for publication, that I've done my very best, which is as good as it gets, because I don't believe it's possible to ascertain whether perfection has been achieved when it comes to this stuff. That's because, just as in creative writing, the writer doesn't get to decide what a text means to the reader. We meet our readers at the text, and we have to turn it over to them before they can get started on their part of the meaning-making process. The end result is a document that represents the heart of the work we'll carry across the tenure line. And when I say work, I don't mean projects. I'm talking about the processes we keep committing to. Something brought us here, and something keeps us here. When we go up for tenure, we're not asking to stick around for just one more project. We're asking to keep doing the work, no matter what it looks like. Once I shoved aside the part of myself that didn't want to take the risk of being me and didn't want to seem boastful, and once I understood all the room I had to bring my charmingly messy career into this rigid form, I actually did have a good time because I articulated something new about the meaning of work for myself. Work is hard. Committing to doing the work in a way that's unusual or at least untested is very hard. And it's my life's work to get hard things down in writing. Whatever your work is, I hope you have that blissful click of the right words, the words you know are the right words, fitting themselves into the blanks that can intimidate us and confound us before we make them our own.